We're going to get straight into it in terms of both of your books, but if you want to go ahead and just say the title of your books really quickly. Go ahead.
Well, I'll start. First of all, thank you to everyone at Ake for having me. It's wonderful to be in Nigeria. You know, I'm a Ghana boy, so I know the area, but I've never been in Nigeria myself. My book, what I'm going to be talking about today, is called Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire, and I think it might have a lot of resonances with Howard's work as well.
Good afternoon. My book is Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. And I will have time to talk about it, but I have to say how deeply I appreciate everything that Lola has done for these last 10 years. And what a pleasure it is to be back here for this event. It has meant so much to me to return here and to be back in Nigeria and in Lagos specifically. I consider, and my book gets into this specific geography to be the fountainhead of the modern world and of the Atlantic world, and the platform on which, or from which, everything that we take for granted and know and experience was built. And so I'm honored to be here among you, and I am so proud of Lola and of everything, really, that she has done in these last 10 years. It's beyond description. Thank you.
All right, so both of your books are ultimately making arguments that the modern world and modern civilization as we know it, in terms of economic success, experience in the West at large, and in your case, Kojo, in Britain specifically, were shaped by Africa and at cost to Africans. How does this legacy manifest in economic and social cultural ways between Europe and the continent today?
Well, I'll start with that. Thank you very much for that question. I think I will introduce kind of two concepts to really show how this idea of what happened in West Africa and Britain's colonies more broadly impacts on even economics in Britain today, to try and make my argument a little bit clearer. And that's two different concepts. One, the concept of development, something that we've heard a lot of, and then the newer concept that I try and explore in the book, this idea of the boomerang. Now, I think a lot of people here might have grown up in between Africa and Europe, or Africa and North America, and will be familiar with the problem of trying to rationalize the differences between the socioeconomic and political context that you might have been experiencing growing up. I know that that was my experience growing up between Ghana and Britain, and the explanation that I was often given for the difference that you might see in healthcare, in education, in wealth between Ghana and Britain was the idea of Ghana being a developing country and Britain being a developed country. This idea of development, this one-way movement of history, and the promise that, well, as long as countries like Ghana and Nigeria or Bangladesh or Singapore, followed the rules, ate their vegetables, said their prayers, and did everything that the IMF and the World Bank told them to, eventually they would have economies very similar to places like Britain and America. And I think looking at the world in 2022, we can see that that movement of developing into developed isn't something that's manifested. This category of developing is kind of like, the waiting hall of purgatory. You're always developing, you're never quite developed. But instead, what we started to see is a lot of the dynamics and a lot of the trends and a lot of the issues that used to be seen as the preserve of the developing world now starting to manifest even in the developed world. And this is very clear in Britain. People might have seen over the last few weeks the economic chaos of the Liz Truss government. There's a lot of WhatsApp group chat amongst Ghanaians saying that, Britain got a Ghanaian chancellor, and all of a sudden the British economy started looking like Ghana in the 1980s. We started to have the bond market devaluation. You wanted to have escalating wealth inequality and huge insecurity of people's living standards, a fall in everyday in the possibility of people being able to meet their living standards. Perhaps a clear manifestation is the discussion of potential electronic rolling blackouts over Britain over winter. So, we're getting dumso, for those Ghanaians in the audience, light off in Britain maybe. Why is that happening? Why are we having this reverse dynamic of development? This is what I really try and talk about in Uncommonwealth. And I think that rather than explain the difference between the colonies and Britain through development, I would use this idea of the boomerang. And this is a concept that was really developed by the Martinican post-colonial theorist, Aimé Césaire, who talked about how the actions of Europe in the colonies does not simply stay in those colonies, but eventually ricochets and boomerangs back into Europe itself. Now, Césaire was talking about the kind of colonial violence of Italy and Germany in places like Namibia and Abyssinia, influencing the rise of European fascism in the middle of the 20th century. But I try and use that same dynamic to talk about how the structural adjustment programs, the conditional loan agreements, all of these economic violences that impacted West Africa, but not just West Africa, so many of Britain's former colonies in the second half of the 20th century, have created the conditions for the austerity, for the financialization of the economy, for the privatization of the economy that even people in Britain are wrestling with even up until 2022. And I try and use a set of examples looking at actions that happened in decolonization, from the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah to the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran, and show how that impacts how often the very same companies, we talk about the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company like there's some distant colonial company that doesn't exist. They simply changed their name to First British Petroleum and now BP. So there you can already see that continuum of what happened in the colonies impacting what's happening in Britain up until 2022. And I can talk about that more a little bit later.
Howard?
Thank you. I would extend the timeline. And not to take issue with anything that Kojo said, but I think the story, as the subtitle of my book suggests, really begins far earlier. And a central argument of my book is that the wealth of the West, and more specifically the divergence of the West in terms of economic development and of prosperity, was predicated first and foremost on exploitation of Africa and of Africans, and that this begins in the 15th century, and that we have been taught a story about that period in time that is radically different from the reality. The story that we tend to have been taught is that the Europeans were hell-bent on reaching the continent of Asia, that they saw Asia as being the secret to gaining greater wealth for themselves, and that they envisioned Africa simply as, or understood Africa simply as a geographic obstacle that needed to be circumnavigated. And in that manner, Africa is entirely cut out of the narrative of the creation of the modern world. Instead, we get in the conventional historical accounts a presentation of this thing called the Age of Exploration, which delivers to us a cast of great navigators who finally do reach Asia, and then, at roughly the same time, also more or less by happenstance, reach the so-called New World. But Africa doesn't appear anywhere in the story, really, when in fact the reality is that beginning in the early decades of the 15th century, the Portuguese, being a relatively new kingdom in Europe, the Aviz dynasty specifically, and a very poor and fragile kingdom, set as their mission connecting with Africa for the purposes of wealth acquisition. And the reason they did this was because in the previous century, meaning the early 14th century, they came to understand enough about African history and African wealth to tell them that this was the key. And this begins in Mali, in the Malian Empire, with an emperor in the opening years of the 14th century named Abu Bakr II, who launched two efforts to cross the Atlantic Some of you may never have heard this. You may think this is science fiction or fantasy or some kind of Afrocentric kind of view of history. This is very well documented. Contemporaneous accounts written by the scribes of the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt when after Abu Bakr II dies in or disappears in the second of these attempts to cross the Atlantic. His successor, a person that many of you will have heard of, Mansa Musa, then makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, and stops on the way in Cairo and distributes 18 tons of pure gold. Mali was a gold superpower in this age. It was the major source of gold in what for the Europeans was then the known world. And this depresses the price of gold for at least a decade. Gold becomes less than a tenth the value of silver, which is reverse of the normal historical ratio. And the Portuguese, not having a window onto the Mediterranean Sea as the Spanish and the Italians and the other southern Europeans did, said, we've got to find a way to connect with this African empire. And so this is the spark of the beginning of the modern era, and quite the contrary, to the contrary of the myth of the age of discovery that we're taught, which is all centered on Asia, under the auspices of Henry the Navigator, a prince in the Aviz dynasty. The Portuguese launch a multi-decade effort to explore Africa and to develop economic, and this may surprise you, political and diplomatic relations with African polities in the 15th century. This culminates in 1471 with their arrival in what is now present-day Ghana and the discovery of extraordinary wealth in gold at the port of Elmina, which I posit as the sort of departure point for the modern age. It is not the discovery of the Americas. It is not the discovery of a route to India and to China via the sea, and it is not about circumnavigating Africa. So where this connects with Kojo's narrative is that if one takes up this metaphor of the boomerang, I think that you can understand the history of these last centuries as a period in which the West was launched and then was able to coast on the backs of imperial relations that were developed with the so-called Third World, but which started and which persisted for the longest period of time in Africa. And because of the extraction of human resources, meaning via the enslavement of Africans, the invention of chattel slavery as an institution, the development of sugar as a history-changing process. Sugar, I can tell you, you ask me a question about the modern world and I can relate it to sugar. Sugar, which is surprisingly the origin of democracy in Europe. Europe has been coasting on the backs of these things for all of these years, and finally they have lost the momentum that these events created, and this is when the boomerang takes place. Just to close the buckle, because I've made some big claims here, so you don't think I'm just, talking, right? So, coffee and sugar become commonly available products in England in the 17th century. In 1650, the first coffee shop, these are both slave-grown products, the first coffee shop is opened in Oxford. Whoever the clever entrepreneur is who put coffee and sugar together lit the world on fire. Coffee shops then spread incredibly quickly to London, and within the space of a decade or a little bit more, there were coffee shops everywhere in London. And what happened is that, as one might imagine, people linger at coffee shops. Look at a Starbucks today. People sit around in coffee shops. They are alert. English people, like other Europeans, didn't have reliably safe sources of water to drink because of hygiene in that era. And so during the daytime, Europeans, well, I'll speak to English, the French drank wine, English people drank ale, even at the workplace. And ale induces torpor, if not outright drunkenness. So now comes coffee, and sugar, which are stimulants, and people are sitting around in coffee shops being stimulated and having lively conversations about the affairs of the day. This is the birth of the modern notion of citizenship in England, where people begin to take it as their right to know and to be able to discuss freely what is happening in Parliament, what is happening with the Crown, what is happening in terms of war, with taxation, with anything important in the day. And some other clever entrepreneur decides, well, so we have these captive audiences addicted to sugar and caffeine sitting in coffee shops. What if we could sell them a product that would tell them what's happening? This is the birth of the newspaper. All of this flows from connections with Africa, from exploitation of labor from Africa, from the invention of this terrible institution called chattel slavery, and from the plantation economies which grew out of it. And this is the rocket fuel that set Western Europe, specifically Atlantic-facing Western Europe, on a trajectory that for the first time in history lofted it above the great societies of Asia, notably China and India.
Well, there you go. So, Kojo, one argument that I thought was really stark in on Commonwealth was the notion that capitalism was born out of empire, rather than the other way around, which most of us tend to think of. Does this mean that if there is to be an end to the neocolonial empires that we are technically on this continent still in relationship with in terms of capital, what does that sort of future look like economically for many African nations who have adopted similar economic structures?
Brilliant. Really, really important, I think, challenging question to wrestle with. And I think one that connects to the deep history that Howard just mapped out for us. You know, when I talk about this idea of capitalism, and even when I talk about this idea of Britain being born out of empire, out of the imperial project, I think it's often one of the more counterfactual claims that I make in On Commonwealth. But it's something that is just mapped out by the historical fact. You know, we often say, and I might say even almost reflectively, this idea that Britain had an empire, you know, France had an empire, Belgium had an empire, Britain had an empire, when it's much more accurate to say that the empire had Britain, as in the political and constitutional formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain was very much born out of the imperial project. An example is that the constitutional relationship that Britain has with Barbados or with Jamaica predates the Acts of the Union, which actually unifies England and Scotland as a single constitutional state by decades. By the time we get the two main nations of Britain joining together legally, Britain already has colonies in the Caribbean through Barbados and Jamaica. It already has the Virginia slave colonies. It already has slave forts across West Africa in now modern-day Ghana. It's already a colonial entity before it unifies with Scotland, and the main driver behind that unification was the promise of imperial wealth that allowed the Scottish nobles to forsake their centuries-long resentments towards the English and join up in this political union. Scotland had its own failed attempt at colonization in now modern-day Panama with New Caledonian, and anyone who's read, you know, the great Scottish poets like Robert Burns understands that it was this promise of colonial gold that brought Britain together. And so with Britain, you then have this emergence of now modern-day capitalism, which Howard mentioned as being born out of the coffee houses of the 17th century, and that emergent mercantile and entrepreneurial spirit that was really rocket-fueled by the potential wealth of the imperial project on offer. And I think that this is often forgotten when we think about what was the driving force behind empire. In Britain recently, over the last, few years, there's been increasing conversation around the decolonization of the public space. The decolonization of art galleries, the decolonization of street names, the decolonization of statues, pulling down statues. And whilst this kind of cultural and symbolic representation of empire, I think, is important, part of me wanted to scream almost like, we do know that the main purpose of empire wasn't like a global statue building project. Like, this wasn't what empire was about. It wasn't simply about cultural dominance. It wasn't even simply about the imposition of racial hierarchies across the world. All of those different elements were in the service of its core motivation, which was the material extraction of resources and the transfer of those resources over the world. The transfer of gold and oil and coffee and sugar across borders. This is what empire was about. It was a material project. And its relationship to capitalism is that what the British Empire, more than any of them, allowed for was an umbrella that meant that country, or companies more like, because the British Empire was so good at the use of private colonial companies, that's what made it the most successful empire of all time, whether that's the Hudson Bay Company in North America, Royal Africa Company, Royal Niger Company, East India Company, most famous of all. These companies could move resources from India to Nigeria to Jamaica to London, and it's all under one jurisdictional umbrella. What decolonisation in the 20th century did, and this is the story that I kind of take on from Howard, is that it broke up that umbrella. It meant that now, rather than being under one sovereign umbrella, there were multiple different governments that could impose labor laws, tax restrictions, protectionist economic policy. And what happened in the aftermath of decolonisation was the weaponization of the private capital legal legacies of empire, things like the structural adjustment programs, the private arbitration panels, the conditional loan agreements. All of these different tools were used to undercut the sovereignty of those new independent governments, which allowed for global capitalism to continue to function as it does even now. And that, I may argue, has consequences in Britain and America, as well as in Ghana, Nigeria, and in Asia. And I think that that is the question that a lot of people have to wrestle with, not just in Britain, but also in Africa at the moment that you mentioned, is that can we have a change of the relationship between democracy and capitalism in any one country, or does it have to happen on a global scale? Because if what happened, I think, in Britain, I use this metaphor a lot in the book, that in the mid-20th century, with the rise of kind of social democracy and the welfare state, the British state almost treated global capitalism like a beloved family pet, where they said, in the house, you've got to behave yourself. You know, you've got to respect labor laws, you've got to respect tax restrictions, you've got to listen to the rules. You know, don't bite the kids, you know, don't tear up the couch. But outside, you can bite anybody's kid you want. You can destroy the place. And now in 2022, they're wrestling with companies that are functioning almost like an unruly pet within the house. And for me, the solution of that is for people to connect the interests of everyday people and democratic accountability, not just in Britain and America, but also thinking about how that might connect all across the world.
I expect Kovie has something else to ask me, but I just wanted to add something to this discussion. On Scotland in particular, the institution of chattel slavery and plantation production of commodities was the sweetener that allowed Britain to come together as a union. The Scottish were offered privileged spaces in colonial empire in the plantation world, as lawyers, as managers, and as other sorts of agents in the sugar domains of Jamaica, of Barbados, and various other places. They were not, in fact, the Scottish, were not, in fact, welcomed yet in England. English people did not want Scottish people in their midst. And so a Scottish elite might have asked, why should we join you in union? And the English answer was, because we'll let you get in on this empire game and you can rise too, just like we are. On capitalism, you know, just as the story has been mistold, and I don't believe this is an accident, that Africa was simply an obstacle and it was all about circumnavigation in order to get to Asia. The story of capitalism itself is mistold. The story of capitalism, we are urged to believe, is something that begins in the Lancashire region of England. Some ingenious people figure out new forms of labor organization. They put together these fancy devices called modern looms, all under one roof, and then suddenly you have a textile industry. This is not the beginning of capitalism. Capitalism begins in Barbados, in Jamaica, and various other places in Brazil and throughout the Caribbean, where for the first time in history, you have large numbers of people, and I'm talking about, because it's the first time in history, a scale far larger than anywhere in Europe at the time, working in one business, for one firm, and these firms, so to speak, were sugar plantations. And what made them specifically capitalist in organization were three things. Their scale, I've already spoken to the large numbers of people employed, the demand for specialized training and skills for very specifically different types of workers. So these are key attributes of capitalism. You have people working in highly trained specialties, and sometimes these highly trained specialty workers were in fact enslaved people. Often they were enslaved people. And the third piece of this was the importance of synchronicity. You can't produce sugar without exquisite care to timing and to sequence and making sure that various operations mesh precisely in terms of their execution. These are all things that we associate as bedrocks of capitalism. But the way the history of capitalism is taught to us is this doesn't actually begin for another couple of years, and it happens in England. And there's a reason for that, because you need to, if you are in the imperium, you need to have a story about how good things stem from your virtue, from your genius, from something special about you that elevates you over others. And to situate this story in slavery would be to undermine all of that. Just to finish on this particular point, so going back to Lancashire and the birth of textile industries in England, where do we think the raw materials for these textiles came from? They came from the Mississippi River Valley. More than 90% of the cotton that was used to fuel, so to speak, these mills in the Lancashire region came from Africans and the descendants of Africans put to work as chattel in the Mississippi River Valley. And so we are taught that the English people discovered or invented or innovated their way toward capitalism, and out of this story entirely is cut from this story the narrative of where the stuff came from in the first place. You don't get a textile mill without cotton, and the base of this cotton production was the enslavement of Africans.
Really quickly. Let's try this one. Really quickly on that point. In your book, Howard, you really sort of hone in on, how African bodies were controlled, were colonized, were enslaved, and that is central to how the economic world of the economic constructs of the last 500 years are built. And your book, however, stops at the Second World War. But an Afro-pessimist might say that this still continues despite the independence struggle. What would you have to say to that?
I'm delighted by this question. What I have to say about this is that the Ake Festival must continue because I have another book coming. And it picks up with the Second World War. And it picks up with decolonization. And it picks up with the argument that contrary to the narratives that we are encouraged to believe in the West, decolonization was the most important event of the 20th century. It was not the thing that Americans call the efforts of their greatest generation to fight fascism in Europe. It was not the heroism of the people of London as they're being bombed by the Nazis. I don't mean to say that people who lived those experiences have no reason to remember them or to be proud. But the big event of the century was the second emancipation that took place throughout the so-called Third World and whose heartland was Africa, where the greatest number of places were decolonized and where the basis of life was changed radically for extraordinarily large numbers of people for the second time in history, meaning the first time being the end of literal enslavement, and the second time being political enslavement. And so I consciously cut the book off. I've already covered 600 years in Born in Blackness, and publishers sort of groan if you want to make a book very much longer than that. And so the next book this was all conceived with an idea to continuing the story forward.
Can I just turn it? Here. Or we can just turn it. It's like hot mic, like one of them's going to work and we just pass it around. Just to echo that point that Howard made, it's a key argument that I make in Commonwealth as well, the idea of decolonization being the great event of the 20th century, beyond either of the world wars, beyond even the communist revolution in Russia. It is the transformation of the global map that is most significant in terms of how politics, economics, law would function for the rest of the 20th century. I argue that trying to even understand the 20th century without having a solid grasp on decolonization is almost like trying to understand the 17th or 18th centuries without understanding the American Revolution or the French Revolution. And yet, at least in the United Kingdom, which is, after all, the main character in so many of these decolonization struggles, it's usually, the antagonist in so many of these national independence stories around the world. This entire global transformation is almost entirely erased from the popular memory. At the time of the last Commonwealth Games, there was a YouGov poll that was ran, which asked random people in Britain to name Commonwealth countries, and it found that 1 in 5 British people couldn't name one Commonwealth country. Not one, not India, not Jamaica, not even Australia. None of them were aware of where the British Empire had been, when it ended, how it ended, what were the contests around its ending. Were some of them violent as they were in Cyprus and Kenya? Were some of them kind of jurisdictional like they were more in Ghana? All of these histories were ignored, and this isn't a kind of reflection on those people. It's a reflection of a system of amnesia that has been anchored into our educational and cultural memory in the United Kingdom, which I argue leaves us unable to understand how the modern world functions in 2022.
I usually do refer to that as historical amnesia, by the way. But I want to sort of move along into, in everyday African life, across countries, perhaps away from some of these specific histories that are miscast or even hidden for Africans in terms of the understanding of ourselves. In terms of nation states, there exists an idea that we put too much emphasis on European domination of Africa today. And because perhaps of the lack of progress politically, economically, social, culturally in our own nation states and our own disappointments with that, we sort of look to our own forms of government as having the responsibility. So how do you weigh that sort of colonial and enslavement history and the responsibility of that against sort of the political realities that we deal with on the continent?
Thank you. I want to just say just something very quickly about the last question, and I'll come right to this. I want to quote or paraphrase Aimé Césaire again, the great Martinican thinker of the last century, who said that Europeans were fine with fascism, as long as it was operated on non-Europeans. And when fascism became, or targeted Europeans, then fighting it became a great cause. This, I think, is a very productive way of thinking of the 20th century and thinking why the Second World War was not the great event of the century. And that decolonization, as I said, and I think as Kojo agrees, was. On your question, Kovie, I'm not one of these people who thinks it is productive to raise colonization as the answer to every ill in Africa. But I'm also not one of these people who thinks, as one so often hears, that colonization and the enslavement over a period of centuries of Africans is of no consequence in understanding Africa's present condition, right? I believe that honesty compels us to understand that the world economy has certain structures to it, and that these structures are, in fact, unequal by design and inimical to the entry of new powers into the fray, and that this has happened purposely over a period of time. This is the afterlife of imperialism that Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism. I don't believe Kwame Nkrumah was ill-inspired in coming up with this conception. Let me say something about the longer-term nature of what Africa is dealing with, though. It is commonly observed that Africa, or Africans, did not, with very few exceptions, design the contours of their countries. They did not map out 54 countries and call it the map of Africa. This was done to them. And to people who would like to sustain this view that Africans have been independent for a very long time, why are they still making excuses about things that happened in the past? What is the very long time? Africa was colonized still in my lifetime. I don't know how old the average age of the audience is, but I don't consider yet my own lifespan to be particularly long in historical terms, right? In fact, let me take this home to my country. Africans, or the descendants of Africans in my own country, were subjected to a kind of internal colonization and legal inequality, legalized inequality in my lifetime. These are not matters of distant history. These are recent events. These are facts that date from a mere yesterday, metaphorically speaking, in terms of the span of time. So how is Africa going to emerge into a better future, I think, is the part of the premise of your question. And I think part of the answer is, again, Kwame Nkrumah understood this he understood the problem without having devised a solution. Having 54 countries is not a good recipe for success. Having lots of Togos, I don't mean to pick on any particular country, or Malawis, or Swazilands, or even Ghana is a relatively small country, is not a formula that favors the emergence of a strong nation state. You don't have the size of market, you don't have a population base that can serve as a form of leverage in terms of attracting industry or being a platform for the birth of strong companies and the like. This is a fundamental problem for Africa. I believe, last time I looked at this, there are at least 17 African countries that are totally landlocked. What are landlocked countries supposed to do? They were created that way, and they must live with it now. Being a landlocked country, I've read in certain economic scholarship, is like having a 20% tax on your GDP every year. So that's like a surtax of 20. And we're not talking about the higher risk of violence which exists for landlocked countries, conflict with your neighbors with landlocked countries, because landlocked countries on average have many more neighbors. Countries that have a seafront have the sea as their neighbor, right? 20% of your income or of your wealth taken away every year simply by the virtue of the borders that you have, right? How are Africans going to deal with this? Well, as I said in a talk at a separate event yesterday here in Nigeria, Africans have been wrestling with this from the very beginning, and there's no obvious or easy solution. Kwame Nkrumah wanted to figure out how to draw countries together, and with the idea of surrendering a degree of sovereignty to a greater whole. And this didn't work on the continental level, obviously. It produced the OAU, which became really a club of incumbents, basically. He created sub-regional organizations of several different types, a union with Guinea and Mali, two French-speaking countries, neither of which has a border with Ghana. He was exhausting every degree of ingenuity and investing Ghana's resources in trying to make this happen. But once the germ of the nation state, as drawn up in Berlin, was planted, it became incredibly hard to deracinate or to uproot. And Nigeria tried. Nigeria, in the 1960s, underwent a civil war. That was about how do we get out of this formula and try to figure out for ourselves something that feels like it fits better. I don't think probably not any, I don't think most Nigerians, I'm not here to speak for Nigerians, but I don't imagine most Nigerians think that a civil war is a good recipe for getting out of this. So what is the way? This is a tremendous predicament that Africa faces, and it is the fruit of imperialism. That doesn't mean that African governments can be expected to be relieved of any responsibility for performance, or for effort, or for rigor, or for the defense and promotion of what they can best devise as a sense of the true national interest. And many, perhaps most African countries might be judged to be failing on that basis. But the fundamental issues that underlie the realities of the African nation state derive from a previous era and are chained to the lives of African countries like a leg iron today, and no one yet has figured a way out.
On the same question, I think what I'll try and do is to just reflect on this idea of what do we mean by colonization and the legacies of colonization, because I don't think it's as simple as simply saying if we connect problems that exist within the African continent today to legacies of colonization, that we're blaming Europeans for everything. That, oh, this is just the Europeans again, and this isn't being manifested and perpetuated and repurposed with native kind of hands on the instruments of statecraft. That can still be legacies of colonization, even if there's not a European to be seen for miles. I don't think there's anybody who's spent time in a Ghanaian visa office or a Nigerian visa office who might feel that, yeah, we can blame ourselves for some of our problems. This isn't all simply Europeans. But what we are talking about with colonization, as Howard mentioned, is the over 400-year legacy of framing the rules that govern the modern world. And the rules that govern the modern world, particularly when we think about the African continent, have a real concern with the tension between the interests of global capitalism and the potential disruptive power of popular democracy. To kind of draw upon a protege of Aimé Césaire, who we've mentioned a lot over the course of this talk, the other great Martinican political theorist of the 20th century, Frantz Fanon, we can often see the problem that African states faced after independence as having to navigate the pitfalls of national bourgeoisie, the pitfalls of what happens when local elites take on the instruments of statecraft and are faced with that same problem of having to govern a jurisdiction that was framed in order to facilitate the transfer of resources simply to the global market, not about the cultivation and development of strong institutions, but to allow for this kind of particularly extractive form of capitalism. Now that influences the type of governments that emerge or type of governments that are allowed to emerge in these particular jurisdictions. The kind of rise of authoritarian governments that we saw on the African continent, in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, isn't because, Africans have this kind of innate desire for a strong leader, all these kind of, quasi-eugenicist explanations that were often given in the British press. Well, they're uncivilized people, they just need a strong chief to kind of crack down upon them. No, this is because that is the most effective way of minimizing popular dissent in order to allow a very extractive form of capitalism to continue to develop unencumbered. And this is part of the reasons why we're starting to see, again, using this idea of the boomerang, kind of mechanisms and forms of democracy-limiting government now starting to manifest in the former heart of the imperial world, the former global north. This rise of, kind of authoritarian nativist strongmen that we're seeing not just in Brazil or India, but now with a Boris Johnson in Britain or a Donald Trump in America. How many comedians and writers talked about how Donald Trump reminded them, of an African president, reminded them of, any of the kind of great strongmen of the 20th century. The reason why we have that, or why the kind of, the Capitol Hill riot reminded you of this undercutting of the legitimacy of democracy and elections, though it used to be seen as the preserve of the backwards nations of the world. Oh, it's only in Africa they can't accept democratic elections and will try and storm the government to overthrow them. Instead, we're starting to see those forms of statecraft emerge in the West, because I argue we're starting to see the type of extractive capitalism that was really cultivated and sharpened on the African continent now being applied all across the world. I think that, following from a lot of Howard's argument, I think that even in the 20th century, we can see the African continent being used almost like a laboratory of capitalism to test out ways in which we can have wealth extraction whilst devastating the lives of everyday people in those countries. And now that's been practiced on the African continent, we're seeing it being used and applied, perhaps not to the same intensity and with the same levels of violence, but with a definite echo of those dynamics, even in places like the United Kingdom and the United States up until 2022. And so for me, it's a real reversal of this idea of development if we want to understand what's happening to states all across the world. We can see what happened in the African continent as happening first and worse there, but it is coming for all of us, no matter where we might have a passport. So yeah, those precious red passports that a lot of us British people have might not be the protection from economic violence that we think it will be.
That's not supposed to be a joke. It sounds like one, but it's not supposed to be a joke. This will probably be the final question. But I wanted to, we've talked a lot about capitalism, and when it comes to the African continent, your books ultimately both talk about racial capitalization, racial capital. And in this continent, certainly in this particular country, which I'm from, not true of all African states, but there is a tendency to sort of de-racialize ourselves, even when we are racialized by others, and particularly, obviously, Europeans. And because of that, I think that because of that deracialization, the argument for that is that European constructs of race are imposed on us. To that point, can African states move forward with their own frameworks rather than the ones that are imposed on them by a racial capital? And I'm sure the audience would like a little bit of hope in your answers.
thinking about this blame question, right? So how much responsibility is due to Europeans? How much is inherent to Africans and the management of their own affairs, right? The 1960s are the decade to look at for this. And to the people who say that was a long time ago and that it's time for Africans to stop making excuses, I don't believe I'm making excuses, but I'm responding to that type of argumentation, right? If you look at the history of the 1960s, what you will see is that these newborn African states and their leaders attempted an astounding variety of different approaches to creating a new basis for life in their countries. Kwame Nkrumah, who we've talked about, sought a solution in Pan-Africanism with a socialist tinge. Right next door to him, Houphouët-Boigny created a model of state capitalism. Across the continent in Tanzania, you get a model of African socialism. I can cite more examples. There is an astonishing variety of attempts to innovate and to create viable systems and dispensations to provide for security and prosperity in the lives of Africans. And none of them can be judged to have succeeded in the long term. And so the question I put to you and to the doubters is this due to an inherent thing about Africans? Is there a bad governance gene in Africans, or some kind of lack of intelligence in Africans, or something about, some pathology that is inherent to Africans? Or is the failure of all of these various attempts to innovate and to create solutions for these newly created states more about, or mostly about, a systemic hostility to the emergence of the grand geopolitical space called Africa into the global economy and political sphere in the 20th century? And I believe that the latter has vastly more to do with the problem than anything that you can cite as a common trait in terms of the personalities or the qualities of Africans as people, right? So, the hope for the future. I do not believe that anyone sitting here today needs to have a complex about themselves as a human being. Hopefully, you don't need to hear that, right? But Nigeria has an answer, as haphazard as it may seem sometimes, to your question. There will be 850 million Nigerians before too long, right? And when there are 850 million Nigerians, who will tell them that you are
I have to stop you. That's a lot of us. That's a whole lot of us.
We're on that path, right? And there are many challenges that this raises, but there is a lot of potential also that this raises. And I believe in that potential. And I believe that these demographics will do something that no African regime has succeeded in doing up until now, and that is refashioning the political map of Africa. That the current setup of the nation state is going to melt under the pressure of African demographics, and that this is going to force the birth of new arrangements that offer much more possibility for Africans. I've just written, just in the last few weeks, an article that appeared in the Guardian long read section that talks about a coastal band of West Africa that stretches from Lagos to Abidjan in Ivory Coast, 600 miles. There will be 500 million people living in this coastal band within the next 60 years. 500 million people. This is going to be the most intensely urbanized stretch of terrain anywhere in the world. I do not imagine myself that Lagos is going to mean in 20, 40, 60 years what Lagos means today, or that Cotonou next door is going to resemble anything like the Cotonou that we have known up until this point in the history of neighboring Benin, or that little sliver tiny Togo is going to be any longer the pristine kind of classic nation state that was imposed on Africans under the Berlin and its aftermath by Europeans. The sort of flag nations, flag states that were created by Europeans are going to be shaken up by this. And this has the potential, this is not going to happen by itself, but it has the potential to unleash extraordinary energies. I was in Ghana this summer, and I talked to some Nigerians in Ghana this summer, one of whom said something extraordinarily interesting to me. He said, you know, I've only been coming to Ghana for the last year or two, but before I began coming here, I always thought that Ghana was our neighbor, meaning right next door to Nigeria. He said, those other countries, Togo and Benin, I never thought about them before. And there are many things one could say about that, but one of them is that the Balkanization of Africa under the Berlin design, the creation of these kind of checkerboard states, French here, English here, French here, English here, has induced Africans, especially in West Africa, to turn their backs toward each other. Not to think of it as going to someplace exotic. It's something very special to think of an Anglophone wanting to go to a Francophone country and vice versa. I had a dinner conversation last night. A good friend of mine here said, what do you make of these French countries? You're going to discover that, all of you, with each other, in a way that will become unavoidable very soon, because the growth of population is going to submerge the border, and it is going to force new solutions, and it's going to create new markets, and it's going to unleash new energies. And Africans have to be consequential to themselves and to have to live up to the potential that this creates for themselves, because the potential is really, truly an enormous thing.
Kojo, you have the final word.
I mean, I wish that could be the final word, because that was fantastic. I would just want to echo everything that Howard mentioned, and also maybe reorientate our gaze not just to the future and to those new concepts and new possibilities and new imaginings and new constellations that are going to come over the next few decades from this particular part of the world, which they very much are, but also think about some of those stories and those concepts and those ideas from the very recent past that Howard, I think, kind of hinted towards when he talked about the work of Kwame Nkrumah, talked about the work of Patrice Lumumba, talked about the work of Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, that when we look at those resources, there are often ideas and concepts that very much seem ahead of their time now, that were never given the ability to actually manifest into their full potential. You know, one we might think of is even the concept of third worldism as a concept. You know, by the time that I started growing up in the 1990s and 2000s, third worldism was seen to be third world was seen very much as an insult. You know, there was very much a kind of hierarchical idea of the world. You know, the first world, capitalist world, second world, communist world, third world for all the kind of uncivilized savages who couldn't look after themselves. It meant poverty, it meant famine, it meant disease, it meant destitution. But when you go back to the 1970s, this idea of third worldism is seen as almost a new possibility of how the world could rearrange itself, a third world, an alternative constellation of our globe. It's something that drew together not just countries in the kind of geographical band of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, but all people who were kind of committed to this imagining of the new world. You know, kind of organizations like the Black Panther Party in the United States of America were third worldist in their orientation. The kind of new left of, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre or Tariq Ali were third worldist in their orientation. And when we look at some of the products of that third world movement, we look at things like the new International Economic Order resolution that was passed in the United Nations, led by people like Julius Nyerere and Michael Manley in Jamaica. Some of the provisions of that resolution look absolutely radical to today. We're talking about the guarantee of a right to food. We're talking about the control of transnational corporations by every local government. We're talking about protection of the environment and of guarantee of clean water supplies. So many of the resolutions, if we look back at that particular document in the 1970s, speak to the challenges of climate change in 2022, speak to the challenges of the migration crisis in 2022. But that particular resolution was killed in the United Nations very much by the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, what we might call neoliberalism nowadays, that emergence in the North Atlantic corner. But now, people in the United States and the United Kingdom are wrestling with questions of climate change, wrestling with questions of migration crisis, wrestling with questions of runaway wealth inequality, wrestling with questions of the unaccountability of private corporate capitalism. And I would argue that they would do a lot worse than to look for answers to those questions in the place that has been so long ignored, right here on the African continent, right here in the third world, right here in the resources that have been cultivated by the people who have been at the very front line of a lot of these issues that we're all going to be wrestling with over the next few decades.
So first I would like to congratulate you because you are really brilliant. And the question is, do you think a new decolonization is needed in Africa? And could it be a great event of the 21st century?
We have, the two of us have mentioned Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana repeatedly in this conversation. And Kwame Nkrumah and his theory of neocolonialism was, in essence, that the imperial powers of Europe figured out a way of maintaining economic control of their former colonies without the fuss and bother of having to try to maintain political control and all of the costs that that incurred to them, right? I believe we are still living within that system. And I believe that for Africa to arrive at the moment of hope that it awaits, it most definitely will have to break out of that system. And so I don't sit before you as somebody with the answer to every question, but that's the goal. The goal is for Africa to arrive at an economic dispensation that offers it every bit as much freedom as its political dispensation since 1957 may seem on the surface to offer it.
Absolutely, and I think that just to, again, echo what Howard mentioned, I think particularly the reason why I look at the British Empire above the French and the Belgian Empire and a lot of its other European rivals is that the British Empire, I think, was most skillful in using private capital and that sphere of private capital to maintain control over their empires whilst having a kind of dressing of statecraft and political control on the top of it. And so whilst Britain had control over the Gold Coast in Ghana, it was the Ashanti Goldfields Corporation that did so much of the work of maintaining that. Whilst Britain had, control over Iran, it was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that did so much of the work of that. And so that makes the actual transition of political control and the transition of statecraft that happened in the mid-20th century decolonization movement simply the removal of the dressing of empire whilst maintaining in place the actual architecture that facilitated so much of that extraction of wealth. And I think that the reinforcement of that subterranean architecture of private capital is now at the heart of so many of the issues that we're facing all across the world, not just in the African continent where they're wrestling with wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is now a debate in the United Kingdom on the news every single day. Not just in terms of the inability to hold tax revenue within a jurisdiction. Now the offshoring of wealth and the privatization of tax exemption is a debate that's going on in Britain every day in the news today. And so we can talk about a new decolonization movement for Africa, and I think that's absolutely essential, but I think in the 21st century, we might even be in a place where the rest of the world is thinking we might need a whole decolonization movement as well. And to kind of make this really concrete, to make it very clear, we can look at how the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in the 1950s overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in order to stop him being able to use or nationalize the refineries in the Abadan region in order to be able to fund a kind of welfare state, to be able to fund education and health policies that were happening, that he wanted to implement in Iran in 2022. The inability for a democratically elected government to control the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had devastating impacts for people of Iran in the 1950s. Now in 2022, there's an energy crisis in the United Kingdom where everyday people are literally having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. There are old people who are choosing to ride on buses because that's the only way they're going to be able to stay warm over the winter because they're unable to heat their own homes. And at the same time, the legacy of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now BP, the largest oil company in the world, is recording record profits in its history. Its own chief executive described the energy crisis as turning his company into, I quote here, a cash machine. And so there we can see the consequences of the legacy of not confronting the real architecture of empire, that architecture of private capital, having an impact on people even in Britain today. And so I think that provides an opportunity maybe for people to hear the arguments of decolonisation even in the West in a way that they couldn't hear and couldn't understand it in the 1950s and 1960s and even the 1970s. Maybe not.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you for listening.